You finish a piece of work you are actually proud of. And before the pride has fully formed, a voice arrives. It's fine, but it could have been better. You know that section wasn't quite right. Don't get too pleased with yourself. You make a mistake, an ordinary, human, unremarkable mistake, and the voice shows up immediately. Not with proportion, not with curiosity about what happened or how to do better next time. With a verdict. You are so stupid. Why do you always do this? What is wrong with you? You take a risk. You say something vulnerable, try something new, ask for something you need. And before the other person has even responded, the voice is already there. That was ridiculous. Why did you say that? They definitely think less of you now. Most of us have been living with this voice for so long that we have stopped questioning whether it is telling the truth. It has become the water we swim in. So constant, so familiar, so apparently reliable in its assessments that it has become almost indistinguishable from reality itself. But here is what the research on self-criticism and the decades of clinical work done by the psychologists, therapists, and neuroscientists who have studied it most closely consistently shows. The inner critic is not reality. It is not an accurate narrator. It is a part of you. A part with a history, a function, a fear, and a wound. And understanding what lies beneath it, using what we are calling the inner critic iceberg model, is the beginning of being able to relate to it differently. That shift, from being at the mercy of the inner critic to being in relationship with it, is the most important thing this video is offering you. A worksheet that maps this iceberg visually is linked in the description. Let's begin. Section 1. What the inner critic actually is. The inner critic goes by many names in the clinical literature. The internal critic, the superego in psychodynamic theory, the critical inner voice in the work of Robert Firestone, the manager or firefighter parts in internal family systems that use self-attack as a regulatory strategy. The name varies by theoretical framework. What the frameworks converge on is the underlying nature of it. The inner critic is an internalized voice, a set of evaluative, judgmental, and often punishing self-assessments that are experienced as internal, but that originate, almost universally, in external sources. In early caregiving relationships, in educational environments, in peer experiences, in cultural messages about what a person must be in order to have value. The voice that tells you that you are not enough did not generate itself. It was spoken to you or communicated to you implicitly by someone or something outside of you, and it was internalized so thoroughly, so early, and so completely that it now sounds like your own thinking. This is the first and most important clinical insight about the inner critic. It is not you. It is a part of you that formed in response to specific relational and environmental conditions. And the fact that it sounds like you, the fact that it uses first-person language and speaks with the authority of self-knowledge is what makes it so difficult to question and so easy to believe. The inner critic is also not fundamentally malicious. This is counterintuitive. It can feel profoundly malicious in its effects, but in every major theoretical framework that has examined it closely, the inner critic is understood as a protection strategy. A part that learned, in the specific environment in which it formed, that preemptive self-attack was safer than waiting for the attack to come from outside. That keeping the self small and corrected and performing was the best available strategy for staying connected, avoiding rejection, or surviving an environment in which failure or imperfection had real consequences. The inner critic is not your enemy. It is a deeply exhausted, deeply frightened part of you doing its best to keep you safe by standards that were set decades ago. Section 2. The iceberg, above and below the waterline. The iceberg model is the most useful framework I know for understanding the inner critic in its full complexity, and it is the basis of the worksheet linked in the description. What it captures is the fundamental gap between what the inner critic looks like from the surface and what is actually generating it from below. Above the waterline, what is visible, what is heard, what most people focus on when they talk about their inner critic is the voice itself, the specific criticisms it delivers, the comparisons it makes, the predictions it offers about failure and rejection and inadequacy. You are not good enough. You always do this. You are behind. You are too much. You are not enough. This is the part that gets noticed, that gets brought into therapy, that the person has usually spent years either fighting, agreeing with, or desperately trying to silence. But what drives this voice, what generates it, maintains it, and gives it its particular charge, lives below the waterline. And there are several distinct layers. The first below waterline layer is the specific fears the inner critic is protecting against. Every inner critic voice is organized around a feared outcome that the criticism is attempting to prevent. The inner critic that attacks you for imperfect work is protecting against the fear of being exposed as inadequate and rejected. The inner critic that compares you unfavorably to others is protecting against the fear of being left behind, left out, or found wanting in competition for love or belonging. The inner critic that punishes you for wanting too much is protecting against the fear that desire itself is dangerous, that wanting will lead to disappointment, that hoping will lead to loss. The criticism is the surface. The fear is what is driving it. The second below waterline layer is the core beliefs, the deep, often implicit convictions about the self and the world that the inner critic is both expressing and enforcing. I am fundamentally defective. I am only as valuable as my performance. If people truly knew me, they would leave. I do not deserve good things. I must earn my right to exist through doing and achieving and being enough. These beliefs are not conscious most of the time. They are the water the inner critic swims in, the assumptions so fundamental that they are experienced not as beliefs but as facts. The third below waterline layer is the original wound, the specific relational and developmental experiences that created both the core beliefs and the inner critic that enforces them. The parent whose love was consistently conditional on performance. The environment in which mistakes were treated as catastrophic rather than instructive. The peer rejection that landed at exactly the developmental moment when belonging was most essential. The caregiver whose own self-criticism was so normalized that it became the child's inherited template for self-relation. The wound is not an excuse. It is an explanation, and explanations are the beginning of compassion, which is the beginning of change. And the fourth, below waterline layer is the function, what the inner critic believes it is doing for you. Keeping you safe, keeping you performing, keeping you from the humiliation of failure by delivering the verdict before anyone else can. Keeping you connected by ensuring you never give anyone a reason to reject or abandon you. The inner critic has a job, and it has been doing that job faithfully, tirelessly, and without a break for as long as you have had it. It is not the job that is the problem. It is the methods. Section 3. Where the inner critic comes from. Understanding the origin of the inner critic is not about assigning blame. It is about developing the kind of precise, compassionate understanding that allows for genuine change, because the inner critic cannot be healed without understanding what it was built to do and why it was built to do it. The most fundamental origin is the process of internalization that occurs in early childhood. Children do not have a separate, independent, self-evaluative system from birth. They develop one by internalizing the evaluative voices, tones, and responses of the significant people around them. This is not pathological. It is the normal developmental process by which the child constructs an internal world that maps onto and prepares them for the external one. The problem arises when the external environment consistently delivers messages, explicitly or implicitly, that the child's worth is conditional, that their authentic expression is dangerous, or that imperfection carries consequences. Conditional approval is the most common breeding ground. The child who receives warmth, attention, and affirmation in response to achievement, compliance, and performance, and who receives withdrawal, disappointment, or criticism in response to failure, need, or authentic self-expression, learns the equation efficiently. My value is performance dependent, and the inner critic is born as the internal enforcement mechanism of that equation, preemptively delivering the withdrawal and disappointment before the environment can, in the attempt to maintain some sense of control over an outcome that felt catastrophically important. Modeling is another significant origin pathway. Children whose primary caregivers were themselves chronically self-critical, who watched a parent berate themselves for mistakes, who absorbed the implicit message that self-compassion was indulgent and self-attack was appropriate, often develop inner critics that sound remarkably like those caregivers. The inner critic is, in these cases, an act of fidelity as much as a protective adaptation. This is how the people I loved related to themselves, and this is how I have learned to relate to myself. Developmental shame experiences, moments of profound public humiliation, peer rejection at critical developmental stages, or sustained messages of defectiveness from authority figures, create inner critics organized specifically around the content of the original shame. The child, who was humiliated for asking a question, develops an inner critic that attacks curiosity and self-expression. The child who was rejected by peers for being different develops an inner critic obsessively focused on social performance and belonging. The child who was told they were a burden develops an inner critic that punishes need and self-advocacy. And cultural and systemic messages contribute to the inner critic's content in ways that are inseparable from the individual developmental history. Messages about gender, race, body, class, ability, all of these shape the specific content of the inner critic's voice, the specific areas in which it is most active, and the specific standards against which it measures and finds the self-wanting. The inner critic does not operate in a vacuum. It is always, in part, a social and cultural phenomenon as well as a psychological one. Section 4. The many forms. It takes. One of the reasons the inner critic is so difficult to identify and work with is that it does not always sound the same. It is shape-shifting in its presentation, adapting its form to whatever is most effective in the particular person's psychological landscape. Recognizing it in its many forms is one of the most practically useful skills in inner critic work. The most recognizable form is the direct attacker, the explicit, harsh, often contemptuous voice that delivers verdicts in the second person. You are stupid. You are embarrassing. You are not good enough. This is the form most people mean when they say inner critic, and it is, in some ways, the easiest to work with because it is the most visible. The perfectionist is a subtler form, a voice that doesn't attack directly, but maintains an impossible standard against which every effort is found perpetually insufficient. It rarely says you failed. It says, this could be better. It says, not quite yet. It says, why would you stop there when there is clearly more that could be done? The perfectionist inner critic masquerades as high standards and drive, which is why it is so rarely identified as criticism. But the exhaustion it produces, the inability to rest or feel genuinely satisfied, and the chronic sense of being perpetually behind, these are its signatures. The comparer is the form most amplified by the modern digital environment, the voice that perpetually measures the self against others and finds the self lacking. It is not concerned with absolute performance. It is concerned with relative standing. And it is fueled, in the era of curated social media, by an endless and entirely unrepresentative sample of other people's highlights, against which it measures the person's ordinary experience and finds it wanting. The catastrophizer operates through prediction rather than evaluation, telling the person what will happen when their inadequacy is finally exposed, when the risk they take fails, when the thing they are building collapses. It produces anticipatory shame rather than post-event shame, but it is inner criticism nonetheless. The self attacking itself for failures that have not yet occurred and may never occur. And the minimizer is the form least often recognized as an inner critic, the voice that does not attack directly, but quietly deflates. That was fine. Others do it better. It's not that impressive. Don't make too much of it. The minimizer does not allow the person to feel genuinely proud, genuinely satisfied, or genuinely worthy of recognition. It is the inner critic's gentler face, but its effects on self-esteem, motivation, and the willingness to be fully seen are as significant as the direct attackers. Section 5. Why arguing with it doesn't work. Most people's first strategy with the inner critic is argument. The voice says, "You are not enough," and the person marshals evidence to the contrary, looks at their achievements, their relationships, their competencies, builds the case for their own adequacy, and finds, reliably, that the inner critic is not persuaded, that it simply waits for the counter-evidence to be presented, and then finds a way around it, finds a new piece of evidence for its verdict, or retreats temporarily only to return at the next available trigger. This is not a failure of the person's reasoning. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of what the inner critic is and how it operates. The inner critic does not operate in the cognitive domain. It operates in the implicit memory domain, in the body, in the nervous system, in the deep structures of self-belief that were formed before language and that are not updated by logical argument. Trying to reason your way out of an inner critic is like trying to reason your way out of a phobia by reminding yourself that the thing is not actually dangerous, accurate, unhelpful, because the fear is not operating at the level where reason lives. Attempts to silence the inner critic are equally ineffective for the same reason, and often counterproductive. The inner critic is a part of the self. It cannot be successfully suppressed any more than any other part of the self can be successfully suppressed for the long term. Suppression produces the rebound effect. The voice that was pushed down returns with more force than it had before the suppression. And fighting the inner critic, treating it as an enemy to be defeated, misses the most important clinical insight about it. It is protecting something. It has a positive intention buried beneath its damaging methods. And engaging it as an enemy ensures that the protection and the positive intention are never accessed, which is exactly what makes transformation impossible. The approaches that do not work all share a common error. They engage with what is above the waterline while leaving what is below the waterline entirely unaddressed. They respond to the voice without touching the fear, the core belief, the original wound, or the function. And the iceberg, approached only from the surface, does not move. Section 6. What actually heals it? The approach that consistently produces the most durable change with the inner critic is one that engages with the full iceberg, and that shifts the fundamental relationship from opposition to curiosity, from combat to compassionate understanding. The first move is getting below the waterline, identifying not just the voice, but what the voice is protecting against. When the inner critic speaks, the most clinically useful question is not, "Is this true?" which engages it at the cognitive level where it cannot be resolved. The most useful question is, what are you afraid will happen if you stop saying this? What is the fear beneath the criticism? What outcome is this voice trying to prevent? That question drops below the surface, into the fear layer, where the real work lives. The second move is understanding the origin, tracing the voice back to its source, with the specific goal of recognizing that the criticism did not generate itself. that it came from somewhere and someone, and that the conditions under which it was formed were not neutral facts about reality, but specific circumstances that are not necessarily still true. The inner critic formed in an environment in which performance was the condition of love. That environment may no longer be the environment the person lives in. The critic has not been updated. Understanding its origin is the beginning of recognizing that its authority over the present is not earned. The third move, and the one with the most robust empirical support, is self-compassion. Kristin Neff's research on self-compassion is unambiguous. Self-compassion is associated with lower levels of self-criticism, higher levels of motivation, greater resilience after failure, and better psychological well-being across populations and contexts. And, crucially, self-compassion does not produce the complacency and lowered standards that people fear. The inner critic convinces people that self-compassion is dangerous because without its vigilance, the person will stop trying, stop performing, stop being enough. The data says the opposite. The harshly self-critical person does not perform better than the self-compassionate one. They perform worse, and they suffer more in the process. The fourth move, drawn specifically from internal family systems, is direct engagement with the inner critic as a part, with genuine curiosity and without the agenda of eliminating it. In IFS, the inner critic is approached with the question, what are you trying to do for this person? What are you afraid would happen if you stopped? And the answer, when the part is genuinely heard rather than fought, is almost always some version of, I am trying to protect them. I am trying to keep them safe from the thing I believe will happen if they are not criticized, and corrected, and kept small. The inner critic, heard this way, becomes something different from an enemy. It becomes a deeply exhausted protector who has been doing a painful job for a very long time, and who, when finally offered something other than combat or compliance, can begin to consider whether it might be possible to put some of the weight down. And the fifth move is reparenting the wound below the critic, going beneath the fear layer to the original developmental wound that the fear is organized around, and offering that wound what it needed and didn't receive. Warmth, acceptance, the unambiguous communication that the self is enough not because of what it does, but because of what it is. This is the work that most deeply and most durably changes the inner critic, not because the critic is argued into submission, but because the wound it was protecting no longer needs the protection in the same way. The inner critic iceberg worksheet in the description walks through all of this. The surface voice, the fear layer, the core belief layer, the original wound, and the protective function, giving both the person doing the work and the therapist supporting them a complete visual map of the full iceberg to bring into the room. The inner critic is not the truth about you. It never was. It is the truth about an environment you had to survive and a part of you that learned, intelligently, adaptively, at a developmental cost that was not your choice, that staying small and corrected and performing was the safest way to stay connected to the people and the world you needed. That learning made sense then. The question healing asks is simply whether it still needs to. Because here is what lives below every inner critic, when you go deep enough, a part that has been working impossibly hard to protect something it loves. A part that has been delivering the harshest possible verdict on you because it is terrified of what will happen if it doesn't. A part that, when finally met with genuine curiosity instead of combat, often has something surprisingly vulnerable to say. You do not have to silence your inner critic. You do not have to defeat it or argue it into submission or meditate it into non-existence. You have to understand it, all the way down below the waterline, to the fear and the wound and the function that have been driving it since before you knew what to call it. And in that understanding, something becomes possible that was not possible before. The choice to relate to yourself differently, to offer yourself something the inner critic never could, to become, for the part of you that has needed it the longest, the voice it was always waiting to hear. The Inner Critic iceberg worksheet is in the description. Map it all the way down. And share this video with someone whose inner critic has been running the show for too long. I will see you in the next one.